Alright, another generic sock puppet response. I've done a few of these and some others because it makes people salty to look at the details, but let's begin with Leonardo da Vinci. Now, genius guy, but what's actually happening with most of these machines and these famous illustrations of da Vinci are actually drawn directly from much older books. For instance, Vitruvius, Heron, and others. Now, we have Vitruvian Man named after Vitruvius. It's literally described in the 10 books of architecture, but also these other machines. So Archimedes screws, water lifting devices, whether it's in Heron or Vitruvius, again described in detail, and it's just a big problem for some people. So much of Leonardo da Vinci's work is directly from Vitruvius and from Heron. It's there in the books now. For instance, this was a reconstruction at an exhibit, thanks to Ninth Heretic she went to the exhibit, shared some of her pics. But what we see here is a method for lifting heavy blocks. Now, for instance, when you see those columns at the top, you see the big architrave, very heavy blocks going across the top. This was the type of machine to do it. Now, Da Vinci described it because at that time, there was a rebirth in classical architecture, so Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns, but also, very Greco-Roman style of architecture. How did the people in Da Vinci's time get those massive blocks on top of the columns? Well, he read Heron. Heron wrote a book specifically on lifting heavy objects and describes those in detail. So at the time of Heron, where they were building the massive temples and those massive blocks on top, well, that was one of the methods to getting. So when people think lifting, they automatically think the extendable boom crane. That's just one type of crane. This is a very different type of lifting device. Now, also, Heron describes these machines of war, very similar to Da Vinci's, but however, Heron's and Vitruvius's descriptions are superior because this method, using that type of bow, is, well, it's not as powerful, it's not as reliable. Everything else is directly lifted from here, the winches and the trigger mechanisms. However, the torsion bundles are much better system of doing that. So in that way, the older ones are much better. Heron also designed some amazing stuff, including steam power. For instance, at temples, he created an automatic steam-powered door. A fire would be lit at the altar next to the door. That would automatically open the door, so the steam would then distill into a bucket. The bucket would fill with water, pull down, that would open, counterweight, and as a counterweight, and that would open the door. But more to that, once the door opened, he had an organ which would play a fanfare. So as the congregation approached, not only did the door open magically before them, so music magically played without the presence of musicians. As Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology appears as if magic. To the people at the time, that would appear as magic, and sadly, in the age of information, so much which is engineering and science is still considered to be magic because, well, I don't know. He also invented, created, I'm not sure of the origins of it, but automatons. He wrote a specific book just on that around Da Vinci's time. This book was getting passed around because of a printing press becoming widely available. Previous to that, you had to travel to a few very rare libraries here and there which kept these books. And, for instance, the works of Heron, air, water, steam, pneumatica, also automated machines, weapons of war, mechanics. We're again describing not only the simple, like all of our modern technology, apart from the combustion and electric motor, is based on simple, and even they are based on simple machines. It's just a power system, so you could swap steam for the combustion engine, but all of them are based on simple machines: the pulley, the lever, the gear. And it's just breakdown. Now, he also wrote a book specifically on lifting heavy weights, where he describes what sort of crane, what sort of method, how to get the mechanical advantage so that a small amount of energy going into the system lifts a very heavy weight. Only a few people is required to lift many, many tons. And those are the machines that they were using that they described at that time. At that same time was the Antikythera mechanism. It's a computer, and it has several purposes. For instance, it could convert between 4 different competing calendars at the time, but it also could predict the positions of sun, earth, moon, or sun, moon, planets, and the zodiac up to over 200 years into the future within such a small margin of error over that time. Fantastic stuff. And what's so important? Well, the Library of Alexandria is important. Now, Alexandria, named after Alexander, he famously founded this city, and he was also a pharaoh. He's depicted in Egyptian style in Egyptian carvings as well. But Alexandria itself, there was an important port before Alexandria as well. So, it wouldn't have just been, it's named after him, but it was around. But what is important is that the Library of Alexandria became the capital of the Ptolemaic or the Greek period of Egypt, and it was a storehouse for knowledge all around the world. It was a famous library. And, for instance, there are stories that when ships came into the port, they would have to surrender all the scrolls or books that they had. Copies would be made, they would be given the copy, and the original would be kept in the library. And so what was thought, Hypatia, other people working in there, they were heliocentric, and they knew the distance from the moon to the earth, predicting eclipses, very advanced astronomy. Geocentric was still very big at that time, but Aristarchus and others were also talking about precession and doing some what we call modern astronomy. So what's interesting is that Heron of Alexandria and Eratosthenes were both working at the Library of Alexandria, giving them access to this ancient knowledge, which was being accumulated from all around the ancient world, and also the Egyptian priests driving their knowledge through into there. So this was a storehouse as well. So the Greeks and Romans invented some of the things there on their own, but for the bulk of it, they inherited ancient knowledge. For instance, Eratosthenes calculated the polar circumference of the Earth. On June 21st, the sun would shine down the well of Syene and illuminate the bottom, and by then working out the distance to Alexandria, because on the same day a shadow was cast, that shadow, using that angle and the distance between them, work out the polar circumference of the Earth. It's also interesting that the 7.2 degrees, which is a nice link, eventually 432, 7.2 degrees, that's 432 minutes of a compass, or 25,920 seconds of a compass, which is the great year. So but the question is, did Eratosthenes discover this by himself, or because he had access to the Library of Alexandria, was he simply recreating an older experiment? One or the other, but I would suggest more likely, at least in my mind, that it was a recreation given all the other, for instance, the scaling of a Great Pyramid to the size of the Earth, that type of thing. So at that time, Heron, working at Alexandria, and not too long before him, Vitruvius, who would have also been just like the Greeks would have been in contact with these older writings. And so firstly, the Egyptian obelisks, the largest, the heaviest ones, not the unfinished ones, the ones that were actually moved and standing. If you want to see them, you're better off going to Rome. Now, these weights, such as the Flaminio, the Solar Obelisk, the Vatican Obelisk, and the Lateran Obelisk, in any other area where there are not written records, descriptions to say who, when, and how it was done, this is considered this is megalithic. Yet when it's described in detail, this is conveniently ignored. I don't know why, but it's also worth mentioning that the Egyptians who moved these large obelisks on the Colossi of Memnon and the Ramessean statue were during the New Kingdom period. So again, not so far, not that far separated from the Greco-Roman. They were much closer, not only in years and what we are to them, but also in the technology being used, in that they weren't using modern electronics. They were using simple machines applied with great intelligence. And so, for instance, the Lateran obelisk, which is now 330 tons, was put back up in 1558. The Vatican obelisk was relocated but never fell. But the original obelisk, Lateran obelisk, was 450 tons. That's the largest largest standing obelisk in the world. Now, the Egyptians moved their obelisks this far, which is pretty amazing, but they only moved it a short distance from the quarry to the Nile, and then a very, very short distance from the Nile to their temples. How far did the Romans do it? Well, they moved them across the Mediterranean. So much added difficulty across the Mediterranean Sea, but also once they got it to Portus, the Roman port, they also had to move it inland over 27 kilometers across very, very rugged terrain. Not a short distance from the banks of the Nile to the temple, but then all this added margin, added difficulty. So the question is, well, how did the Romans do it? Because they took it to the next level. That was much further. Well, like so much else, was this learnt from the Library of Alexandria? If Egypt was clearly moved back in the old times, and the temple records describe the obelisks themselves are inscribed, except for the Vatican obelisk. That's the only one which doesn't have inscriptions, but all the other ones have the original hieroglyphs on there to say who moved it, and well, we can measure it from their temples now. Pause a moment. Okay, so amongst certain commentators and what we have is that when the Egyptians move their obelisk that far, this is evidence of lost high technology, because there's not a clean written record for us to explain how they did it. However, when the Romans did exactly the same thing and added degree of difficulty, much added degree of difficulty, it's all you hear is crickets. And so if Roman engineers could master wood and rope, why is it so hard to comprehend the Egyptians could do the same? Now, for instance, the Lateran obelisk, and here we see these depictions. So not long after Da Vinci, so Pope Sixtus V moved a whole bunch of them, including the Lateran obelisk, and the Vatican. Well, all of them really were, again, even the ones that were still standing were taken down and then relocated within Rome, and they described how they did it. And how did they do it? They did it based on the Roman descriptions of how they achieved the same things. All the materials necessary, so even in the 1500s, they had better iron, but iron is not necessary for this operation. Everything that was necessary to create this lifting towers and the rollers, red cedar, everything that was necessary existed back in that time. And then it's often said, well, oh, look, they had horses. Well, the Egyptian had cattle. So if you ever hear this, it's dumbfounding. Oh, the Egyptians didn't have animals. Well, yes, they bloody did. They had it since the beginning, even before the beginning. Even in the cave paintings from when the Sahara was still wet, they had oxen. If you Google Egypt, what lies beneath, Dr. Sarah Parkak, what she's found is, well, she's used satellite infrared imagery, and she's found undiscovered pyramids, but also using that satellite imagery, she's found undiscovered cities to show the scale of. So it's often said, well, the Romans had a large population, so did the Egyptians, and buried beneath the sands they're finding not little towns but massive cities for their population. Now, why were the Romans so interested in in Egypt? Well, they needed the Egyptian grain from the rich Nile and the Delta to feed the empire. So the Egyptians had large cities with big populations, and they were feeding them, and that's why it was so important to the Romans, not to mention the Library of Alexandria and the knowledge contained therein. So just like the later Greek and Roman engineers, the Egyptians were also importing red cedar from Lebanon. They also had rope, very, very thick rope, and lots of it. And they had the red cedar, just the same that the Romans moved it in antiquity. The popes in the era of Da Vinci, they did exactly the same thing with rope and red cedar. So the Library of Alexandria. So if the Romans could and did, why do people belittle Egypt capacity? Denial.